Kapwe Poko Mio Kisagaw. In my indigenous language of Cree, I just said it is a beautiful day today. Cadmus Nitisi Kasu Kausis Uchinia. My name is Cadmus. I'm from Kausis First Nation. My indigenous language is about identity. And as a young indigenous man living in Canada and remaining indigenous, we inherited quite an interesting history here in Canada. I grew up on Cowes First Nation, which is in southeast Saskatchewan. I graduated from high school on Cowes. After a couple years, I made my way to First Nations University of Canada, located in Regina, Saskatchewan, which is affiliated with the University of Regina. While there, I took a class about Indigenous ideology, Indigenous history. And this warrior spirit awoken in me while at First Nations University of Canada. It started to open my eyes on the truth, on the role Indigenous people continue to play, to be Indigenous in a country that sometimes tried to oppress, that sometimes tried to stop Indigenous people to be Indigenous. And at first I got a little angry, I got a little frustrated, but after a while I turned that energy to strategy, to focusing on what is reconciliation. Today in Canada, we have the 94 calls to action, the truth and reconciliation. We cannot move to reconciliation until we first accept the truth. Over the last summer, the Kamloops Residential School came forward with unmarked graves. Maryville came forward with clarifying the amount of unmarked graves that were affiliated with the Roman Catholic Church and coincided with the Maryville Residential School. If there's something I've learned, it's the following. For Indigenous people, these unmarked graves is validation. Validation of the pain, the frustration, the anger, the tiredness of just trying to remain core to Indigenous, to our language, to our ideology, to our identity, to our culture, and so forth. To my Canadian friends and family, the unmarked graves, the shield is down, and admitting that we don't know about the true truth between Indigenous people and Canada. So we're at a really important time in Canada today to reset our compass on a new forward, a forward where Indigenous people can strengthen their Indigenous ideology while living and sharing this land with Canada. What did we truly inherit, and what really did happen between Indigenous people and Canada? In where we are today in Saskatoon, Treaty 6, where home is for me in Cowes, Treaty 4, treaties is a discussion that happens in Canada between Indigenous people in Canada. In Canada, represented by the Crown, that's who our relationship is with. My signatory chief, Chief Cowes, at the time of Treaty 4 negotiations, was sitting there and trying to understand what this treaty meant. And one of the evenings before the agreement was agreed to, there was this young man sitting there. Everybody was going to this young man. The commissioner, the big bosses. So finally, my signatory Chief Cowes asked the interpreter, "Who's that guy? Who's he?" And the interpreter turned around and said, "He's the lawyer. He's the legal person." And my signatory chief said, "If I agree to this treaty, can my children continue to be who we are as Nehiyawak Anishinaabe people, as Soto Cree people, and still learn the new cunning of the white man?" That was a term at treaty, meaning that evolving through time. And the interpreter asked the commissioner and the others, and they turned and told my chief, absolutely, that is what this treaty is about. And so 2 days later, Chief Cowes has agreed to Treaty 4. And his image was the following. I'm going to use two canoes as an ideology, as something to picture in your mind. I'm not saying we're the Wampum Treaty or that. It's just two canoes as an example. My signator chief envisioned two canoes going down the river. One canoe, Canada, Saskatchewan, the Crown. The other canoe, Cowes. And we were supposed to flow down this river as long as the grass grows, sun shines, river flows. Every generation we were to exchange a child. And those children would be raised in that other canoe to know the ideology. And then they'd be given back as adults. So we'd always, every generation, evolve with each other. That is what was supposed to happen. That didn't happen. 2 years after our agreement to treaty, the Indian Act was thrown in the Cowes' canoe by Canada. And the Indian Act had one purpose. It was a law from Canada to imprison the minds of Indigenous people, to imprison the minds that we don't have a governance structure the way we did, women play a lesser role, and so forth. 24 years later, Canada threw the residential school in the Cowes' canoe. And it had one purpose, to brainwash the Cowes' people so that we no longer didn't know our kinship, that men with braids, it had no purpose, and that it really truly just made us forget who we were as a Nehewak and Anishinaabe people. And my ancestors persevered, but we fell behind. So today, we still have our Indigenous people in this country. Sometimes Canada wants us to abandon our canoe, wants us to stop being Indigenous and just join the Canada canoe, full assimilation. That will never happen. And if anybody thinks that that's still the end goal, you're wasting your energy. Don't waste your energy on stuff like that. What today has to happen is Canada, the provinces, must invest in the Cowes' canoe to catch up. Because that's what Indigenous people want in this country. It's not that Indigenous people want to abandon and go a different direction. Many love living in this country. They love being in a G7 country, a developed country. But Indigenous people have endured a lot. And that's why investment is so it's needed. It's needed in the First Nation communities. It's needed in the cities. Because Indigenous people didn't ask for this. And we truly all inherited this today. Today, nobody created residential schools. Nobody created the Indian Act. But a country that has a Charter of Rights and Freedom that guarantees every one of us will have vertical lineage, that unfortunately didn't happen for Indigenous peoples. And so that is why, yes, we inherited it, but we also all have an obligation. And that is the truth. A part of the truth is that Indigenous people are not asking for pity. We're not asking for anybody to feel sorry for us. We're asking for understanding. We're asking for patience. We're asking for investment so that we can strengthen our vertical lineage again and that we can persevere exactly how Chief Cowes envisioned it in 1874 to share and thrive together. Another part of the truth is there is intergenerational trauma in some Indigenous families, some Indigenous communities. And please, I'm not painting a brush that all Indigenous people are in this category. Many have grown and persevered. But there's something in this country that the Charter of Rights and Freedom guarantees. And many new Canadians, many generational Canadians that come to Canada enjoy the Charter of Rights and Freedom. Because sometimes where their homeland is. That was not an option either. But when you get to Canada, sometimes we're not told about the truth as well when it comes with Indigenous people. So what did Indigenous people actually, what happened? Where did the breakdown happen? Well, with the Indian Act and with residential schools, the best way to explain it is what we call vertical lineage. Our Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedom guarantees everybody in this country that grandma will teach mom, mom will teach daughter, daughter will teach granddaughter. That is a charter guarantee. That's a freedom. Unfortunately, our very own charter and our very own country did not allow that to happen. What happened was the following, and I'm going to use my maternal lineage to explain it. My mother's great grandma was named Gracie. Gracie never attended a residential school. Gracie had Maggie, my mother's grandma. Maggie attended the Round Lake Industrial Residential School. Maggie should have got Gracie's teachings. That's vertical lineage. But Maggie didn't. Maggie went into horizontal survival mode with her sisters, cousins, and friends. Maggie had Evelyn, my mother's mom, my grandma. Evelyn is the second generation to attend a residential school. Evelyn should have had Maggie and Gracie's teachings, that vertical lineage, but she didn't. She was second generation horizontal survival mode. And the abuses were real. Evelyn had my mother Charlotte, third generation residential school survivor in my maternal lineage. Charlotte should have had Gracie, Maggie, Evelyn's teachings, but she didn't. She went into horizontal survival mode, third generation. Charlotte had me. I never attended a residential school. My mother did what she could to figure out the role a mom plays. Because of residential school, my mother was not able to get Gracie's, Maggie's, Evelyn's teachings. My mom had to figure it out as she went while addressing her intergenerational trauma, horizontal survival that she endured. Today, my wife and I have a 5-year-old daughter. My mom and my daughter have a very strong bond. That vertical lineage is now stronger in my maternal lineage. It is coming back. In this country, there are thousands of Indigenous people that walk this land. Sometimes they are in Walmart with you. Sometimes we're in school. Sometimes our kids are in a classroom. We must not judge, but we must understand intergenerational trauma. The aftermath of residential school still continues today. Some families have persevered and found a healing journey where their vertical lineage is strong, and that is amazing. Some are at a 45-degree angle. They're getting stronger. Some are still horizontal survival mode. And that is what I mean about the two canoes. Canada and the province, and as Canadians, we must invest in that vertical lineage once again. That is the best we can do today. We can address it directly today, or we can ignore it and tell our children one day to figure it out. And I'm one to not just pass it on to my 5-year-old daughter to figure it out. I know we can figure this out today. When we talk about truth, truth is not an option. There is only one truth. And one of the things we got to understand is in this country, the way we were told the truth as Canadians is miscued. Today is a lot better, but this is how the education system set us up to understand Indigenous ideology and Indigenous truth. I break it down into generations. The baby boomer generation are today's elders, senior citizens, our grandparents, our great grandparents. In our Indigenous ideology, we call that elders. If you've seen 3 generations in this lifetime, you have earned that respect and that means to give advice and to make decisions. That's our baby boomer generation. As Canada, we must understand we do rely on our baby boomer generation to help us. But what did the baby boomer generation learn about the truth of Indigenous people? It was not taught in schools. Everything that baby boomer generations were taught were mostly from Hollywood movies, from the cowboys versus the Indians. When I play that, the Indians always win. I just want to say that. But sometimes the John Wayne movies, the Indians on horseback, the Indians living in teepees, the Indians giving war calls, that is the extent of education this country gave to our baby boomer generation. Generation X, there was something called the White Paper in 1969. It was an option from the government of Canada for First Nations, for Indians, the solution was to abandon the reserves, to stop being Indian, to stop thinking you have special privileges, just be Canadian. The White Paper was the abolishment of any rights. That was the solution Canada gave in 1969. If anybody thinks that solution, you're wasting your energy. That is not the solution. That will never happen in this country. But that is the extent of what Generation X was taught about Indigenous people. Generation Y, which is becoming our decision makers today, learned a little more. They learned about treaties, but treaties was about surrender. It was about land giving up, stuff like that. Residential schools were still going on. Our generation, our millennial generation and Generation Z today, the spirit and intent of treaties is being talked about. The truth is starting to really step forward. But we must understand that there's no Indigenous Studies 100 mandatory class across this country that's going to happen. It's up to us as Canadians, as Indigenous people, to understand what we truly inherited and what the real truth is. Because we cannot move to reconciliation until we accept the truth. And now that I really addressed the truth from a couple examples, I want to move to reconciliation. What is reconciliation? What is decolonization? Decolonization is going to be a common term into the future, especially with the relationship between Indigenous people and Canada. One of the things we must understand is decolonization is only the beginning. What is on the other side of that Pandora box? We're not sure. But we must persevere and move towards decolonization. There's many means to decolonization. There's many means on how to get there. We must agree on the end goal of a beautiful land, 2 canoes going down the river, respecting each other's ideology and coexisting together. That is the end goal. How we get there, we probably will disagree. We probably will never really understand each other at time to time. But we must not stop moving towards that end goal. Reconciliation means many different things. But the Truth and Reconciliation calls to action, there's 94 of them. 94 calls to action. Who are the authors of the Truth and Reconciliation calls to action? Who created them? It was over the 100,000 residential school survivors who told their experience and story of what happened in residential schools. What legislation must implement the Truth and Reconciliation calls to action? This is it. It is the will of Canada, of Canadians, to implement the truth and reconciliation calls to action. On behalf of the residential school survivors, it is our obligation. The truth and reconciliation calls to action are broken into different categories. And it's a very simple read. Right now, just me explaining to you, we're kind of exercising number 57. That is how easy some of these TRC calls to actions are. They're not heavy, but they're obligations. Some of them are, we need to study them a little more. But that is the end goal to decolonization. One of the things that this country had a missed opportunity of is the beautiful Indigenous ideology that Indigenous people are always trying to share. One of them, as an example, is humor, is laughter. Humor is a law given to us by the Creator. Humor is something that keeps cohesion. If any of you are in an Indigenous community or plan on going to one or ever cross with Indigenous family and you're teased, that's actually a law meaning that Indigenous people like you. Humor is huge in our kinship. But what really ideologies can we bring in today that can help us? One of them is the view we have on the world. Sometimes today our youth who watch YouTube, movies, play video games, TikTok, Snapchat, some of our youth today have seen over 10 to 12,000 people die through video games, movies, and that. And sometimes it gets ingrained in your mind that that's almost a norm. And as they get older, their ideology and view of the world is definitely going to be skewed because of what their brain conceives. One of the things about Indigenous ideology is what we call legendary stories. Before we were Canadian coexisting with Canada, we had a governance structure that worked as Indigenous people. Sometimes when you learn about Indigenous people, you learn about residential schools, Indian Act, 60s Scoop, and so forth. But we also have to understand there was a beautiful governance and lifestyle. There was no children in care, no unemployment. Everybody played a role. We had our own laws, our own justice system, our own economy, and everything coexisted. It was a very beautiful time. So today, one of the areas was a school. There was a school. It wasn't a brick school. It wasn't a school like what we think of a school today. It was a teepee where kids would sit there and learn legendary stories every day. And these legendary stories gave you images and ideology to life. And what it built on your creativity and so forth. I'm going to tell you two legendary stories as I start to conclude. The first legendary story is the legendary story of the dogs. So before I tell it to you, I'm just going to explain to you legendary stories build on your creativity. They give you an image in the world and they allow you to grow as an individual. That's what they do. One day, all the dogs on the land where we are decided to have a grand meeting. So the dog messengers ran out to go tell the other dogs. One of the messenger dogs was telling another dog, and this human being, this male, heard these dogs talking. Because there was a time on the land when animal and people could talk to each other. There was a time when that could happen. Many, many moons ago. This human said, I'll come to the meeting. And the dog said, no, humans are forbidden. This is for dogs only. And this man, this human pouted. You know, when sometimes in life you don't get your way, you pout. And so all the dogs got to this meeting. Every dog would get to the teepee. It was at this teepee. They would get to the teepee door. The dog would unhook their tail, put it on the outside of the canvas, and then go inside. And when all the dogs were in the teepee, they started their grand meeting. Well, this male, this human, was still pouting because he didn't get his way. He said, I'm going to play a trick on these dogs so next time they'll invite me. See, he snuck up behind the teepee and he started a fire. And when the fire got big, he banged on the teepee and he said, fire! All these dogs in the teepee decided they were all trying to get out. They were all kind of panicking. And when a dog got out, there was so many tails on the teepee canvas that a dog would just grab any tail they could, hook it on, and then take off running. And that's why today, when two dogs meet each other, they sniff each other's tail because they're still looking for their original tail. That is an Indigenous legendary story. Now, we know what those dogs were doing. I'm not going to beat around the bush. We know why they're sniffing their tails. But imagine this. Your little niece, your daughter, your granddaughter, and you are at the park. And your granddaughter, daughter, or niece heard this story, and so did you in a school or in an education setting. And your niece, daughter, or granddaughter pulls on your arm and says, look, 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 that dog is looking for their original tail. At how you would share a little smile together, a little laugh. That's what Indigenous ideology brings to kinships. This country needs that more than ever today. Indigenous ideology is not about Canada taking an entirely different direction. Many people love living in this country. Many new Canadians love coming to Canada. But Indigenous ideology was never really accepted, nor did it ever really seep through what Canada has been creating on top of what Indigenous people have always had and tried to share. It is now time that we do that. Like the legendary story, that is just a little glimpse of how beautiful this world could look when we really accept Indigenous ideology into our normal lives living in a country we call Canada. This country is resetting itself right now. And we got to utilize our momentum. It's not that, Canada must accept one or the other. We can coexist together. And that is what is beautiful about Indigenous ideology. Indigenous people, as one Indigenous person, I am a Canadian, but I'm also a First Nation person. I have what you call dual citizenship in this country. There's nothing wrong with that. All that means is because of a treaty, because of us coexisting together, I have a Canadian passport. I go shopping. I do all the things every Canadian does. But because I'm a lineage of the first people, I am also have rights as first people. There's nothing wrong with that. That's something that we must not shy away from, but we must learn more. I'm going to end you with this. One more legendary story to give us more hope looking forward. This is the legendary story of the hummingbird. One day, this lightning struck a tree, and this tree started on fire. This hummingbird was sitting on another tree, and she watched it. And without thinking and even considering not to help, this hummingbird seen a water a long ways away, so she swung down, picked up water in her beak, and went all the way back and spit on this tree, the little water she can hold. All afternoon, this hummingbird did this. Many of us are hummingbirds. She didn't think of herself. She just thought of the greater purpose of making sure that tree's fire could be outed with her help. This raven was sitting on the tree watching this hummingbird go back and forth. And sometimes in our lives, we have ravens too. And finally, this raven told a hummingbird, "Why are you even trying? You're not going to out the fire." And this hummingbird, on her way back to get more water without losing her breath, she said, "I may not out the fire, but every time I pick up water, I make a little difference." We need a lot of hummingbirds in this country to make a little difference so that our children and children yet unborn can have a brighter future. And I guarantee you with that, we will be the greatest country in this world. I thank you very much for letting me share a few words with you. Nanaskamun. Thank you very much.